I had a house on the Bering Strait. The heart of the house was the cocktail room. You could reach it from the kitchen, from the living room, from the bedrooms, from the staircase. It was sunken a little bit. You walked down 3 steps. It had a couple of chairs and a couple of couches. Red velvet or some kind of plush. There was a bar. And on one side you could walk up and there was a glass front, a glass facade with big glass sliding doors, and you could walk out into the terrace outside and look out on the Bering Strait. And it was beautiful. My favorite thing was to go out there in the early morning with a big mug of black coffee. The slats of the wooden terrace were always cool to my feet. It was always a little bit damp, and I could feel the sand crunching under my bare feet. And I would look out over the dazzling white sand and watch the sun come up and until it sparkled on the sand of the beach. And in the evenings, I would go out maybe with a cocktail and watch the sun set and the sea turn purple. The beach was always empty, and I felt the wind blow salt and against my lips and my eyelids. I didn't realize how shallow the strait was until I saw them coming. There were probably 40 of them that I could make out in a long line stretched out. In places, the water would come up to their necks, maybe a little bit over their heads. I couldn't tell quite, but mostly it was shallow. It was below their breasts. They were a ragged bunch. They were strong and kind of squat, and their muscles were knotted and tight. And you can tell from their faces that they broke no humor whatsoever. They carried their food or their belongings, whatever it was, in bundles. They sometimes held it over their heads as they got into deeper water. They held spears over their heads. They held their children, infants, bundled in furs over their heads as they came on. In the evening, I made myself a vodka grapefruit and went out to the terrace to watch and wondered whether they would make it. The phone rang, and I walked into the kitchen and answered, but there was no one on the other end. It was just silence. I hung up, and it was dark outside, so I went to bed. When I woke up in the morning, I was in a sleeping bag under an open sky. I walked to the edge of the cliff, and I could see the desert stretching out endlessly before me. And the rock had that kind of wavy pattern that only rock has. Kind of a rusty orange, red, and brown. And the mesas stretched up into the sky like fingers. There were sky bridges over lonely canyons. There was no sign of life anywhere. The wind was still and the sun was relentless. You could see the heat coming at you in waves, rolling like mad armies of savages, of barbarians with shields and swords rushing at the buttes like storming castles. The other side of the bluff was somehow different. The same, but different in a way I couldn't tell. I couldn't really say. I found a ledge that seemed to lead down, like on a narrow path. And I took a few steps down and walked down as far as I could, hugging the wall with my cheek against the stone, until I couldn't go any further. It was too narrow, and I was afraid I would fall, and I'm sure I would. So I climbed back up to the top. I found an apple there that had been chewed down to the core. In the evening, when it got colder, I climbed back into my sleeping bag and went to sleep. In the morning, I woke up in a deep, warm feather bed. It was so comfortable, I didn't want to leave it at all, forever. There was a fire roaring in the fireplace, and it lit up the cabin in a dark mahogany red. I got up and I wrapped myself in a quilt, and I went to the stove, and there was fresh coffee, and I poured myself a cup, and the only cup there had been used recently, so I rinsed it out before I used it. Outside, the morning was blazing bright. There was snow everywhere, and the sun bounced off it all up and down the mountainsides. The snow was hard-packed like ice, and the silence was beautiful, like in a cathedral. You can only get that kind of silence, I think, in hard-packed snow at the top of the world. I put on several layers of wool and mittens and heavy boots, and I marched out into the snow and down the hill and into a black and white birch forest. It was hard going in the snow. You really had to push through it. The sound of my heavy breathing seemed to echo, and I looked around and realized I had no bearings. It was all the same in every direction. I didn't know where to go or where I was going or where I'd come from. It had no meaning whatsoever. I had no choice but to just keep marching. In any other time, in any other situation, I would have panicked. I would have felt this fear overcome me, and I wouldn't know what to do. But in this situation, at this time, somehow it was a feeling of liberation and joy. I realized if there was no point going any direction, it didn't matter where you went. I never felt so happy in my life. On a grassy steppe, I walked along a burbling blue stream and watched fish in it dart back and forth. The plain seemed to go on forever. And on the bank of the other shore, I thought I saw footprints. I crossed through the stream and followed the footprints as long as I could before they disappeared. I never found out who made them. The walking itself became mesmerizing, hypnotizing. And at some point, I felt like I couldn't stop, and I didn't want to stop. And if I didn't stop, I could go on forever. I would just keep walking. That was the secret. The secret to go on forever is just not to stop. It seemed so simple and so logical. And I felt in that moment whole and as if there was no such thing as limits or a beginning or an end. There was just an endlessness that you could keep on, you could hold on to if you just didn't stop. And I didn't stop. At least, I don't remember stopping. The next morning, I woke up at the edge of the volcano and everything hurt. My whole body hurt. I walked through the field of lava, the cooled, lumpy rock. It was like a huge, endless blanket of lumpy, cooled rock. And I walked until I found weeds pushing through it. One day there was a swamp, and I spent the day in a rocking chair on a porch of an old cabin, only occasionally getting up to try to see if I could find through the woods the origin of the sound of a motorboat somewhere, but I never found it. In the spring, I walked along the shores of an endless mirror blue lake high in the mountains. And in the woods, I could hear a rustling as if there was something in there watching me. And at one point, I could see through the trees a light. And so I walked through the woods, and I found a cabin, and there was a fire blazing in the fireplace. But there was no one there. So I made myself something to eat, and I went to bed. In my house on the Strait again, I stood on the terrace in my bathrobe with a glass of grapefruit vodka in my hand and sand under my bare feet. And I watched them, the men and women, struggling through that water of the Strait. And it occurred to me they were going to make it. I went into the kitchen and I found bread and some cold cuts and some cheese and some mustard. And I made sandwiches, as many sandwiches as I could. And I went out and took the sandwiches along the beach to meet them. I stood there on the beach as they came out of the shallow water onto the sand. They were a scraggly bunch, and they weren't well built, but they were tough. And their faces were marked with exhaustion and determination. They were survivors, I thought. And as they walked past, I handed out sandwiches. I think they were grateful. They didn't say it. What were they going to say? But they ate the sandwiches. And as I handed them out, one after the other, I said, "Welcome to America. Welcome to America." Okay. Let's see if you can do something with that.